coming up next, let's welcome Ren Perry to the stage. Ren is a black, non-binary narrative designer who's actually currently working over at Shell Games as a game designer. When they're not focused in working on Shell Games, on the outside, they dabble in narrative and the programming aspects of game creation. And today, they're here to talk to y'all about horror games. So let's welcome Ren to the stage and please show him some love in the chat.
Hi, and thank you so much for coming to my talk, Mental Illness and Horror Games, Avoiding Stigma and Stereotype. Really quick before we get into it, I just want to talk about some spoilers, but more importantly, content warnings for what I'll be talking about. There will be mentions of psychosis, depression, and some mentions of suicide. I will not be showing any images or talking about anything explicitly very graphic, but just in case. There will also be places where I may use the words crazy or insane to refer to a mentally ill person. That is not normally how I refer to people, but this is how the games treat their mentally ill characters. So, mental illness and horror. How common is it really? So I'd like everyone watching to currently think of a horror game. It can be your favorite, the last one you played, last one you've heard of, whatever. Now think, does this game use mental illness to enhance its horror? So to answer that question, that means no asylums, no sanity meters, no giving a character a general insanity excuse for the way they act, no creating villains that are villains because of insert disorder here. So if you thought of one, here are the ones that I thought of. Soma and SCP, kind of on thin ice, but we'll accept them here. Maybe you thought of some others. However, for every game that doesn't use this trope, there are about 2 of them that do. It's extremely common. But so let's look at some of the actual tropes that they use. This is not a definitive list. This is just the most common and the most harmful that I've seen in games. So the first one, very clearly, insanity meters or sanity meters. We see this a lot in games. It's when the player's vision or perception goes all wonky and squiggly. Usually the player needs to take some item or do some action to return everything back to normal. The next one, asylums are bad / evil places. This also goes hand in hand with the you're not crazy. It's actually this place that's making you crazy. There's the one this one kind of not always as bad, but can be, which is using monsters to symbolize your illness or symptom. There's also the flip side of this, which is there really wasn't any monsters here. It was just you all along. And then the people are just dangerous / untrustworthy because they have some disorder. And then the more common and most harmful, I think, is just misrepresenting a disorder. This kind of is a catch-all for when there's a character, they're probably mentally ill, but they don't really tell you why. They just are like that, and the game's other characters just kind of call them crazy. But cool. So horror games tend to use tropes. So does every story that's ever made. Tropes are made for a reason, and tropes aren't necessarily bad. Every genre has them. So why should we care? A lot of people that I know sometimes like to say that reality is reality and stories are stories, that they should be kept separate because they are separate. However, I think this is a very harmful way of thinking. So as an example, hear me out. There's this one episode of SpongeBob where he ends up making fun of Sandy in order to be funny. Through him making fun of her, the townsfolk then start to also make fun of her in that way and almost kind of believe that she is the way that SpongeBob makes her out to be in his little comedy sketch. And of course, because this is a kid's show, by the end, it's all wrapped up nicely and no one's actually hurt. However, when things happen like this in real life, that thought process that you have when you see someone because you saw something online or in media or in a story doesn't really just go away. It kind of just sits in the back of your brain and you don't really think about it until it's confronted to you again. And some people might see this and be like, well, this is just, it's a kid show. It should just be disregarded and it's not real life. However, I want to now ask you, how many of us still believe that cats like milk, they're lactose intolerant, mice like cheese, it's really not good for them, and that lemmings will still follow their leader off a cliff without a second thought, even though those are all proven to be false? So here is my lukewarm take of the day. Stories shape how we view people. Like I said, some people want to argue that the stories we create and read are different from real life, but I think that, but I believe that that they are not. So does that mean we should just never actually write about mental health? Of course not. Just like with anything, there are good ways to go about it and bad ways. Some games have gotten it right, some games have gotten it wrong. And I think the really difficult thing with horror is that objectively it is made to make us uncomfortable and repulsed as well as scared. When we go into a horror game or any sort of horror media, we know that as we consume it, we're going to be very uncomfortable and probably obviously scared. But we get to experience that fear in a way that makes us feel safe. However, about something like mental health, that those are very real experiences. So when we put mental health in our games to make our players feel uncomfortable, it can be not great. Mental health is already hugely stigmatized. And using that stigma that mentally ill people face to make our game scary doesn't seem to be a good way to go about things. We can still write about mental health and use it in our stories, but that doesn't mean we get a pass when it comes to including these stereotypes and stigmatizing a group of people. So for example, Senua's Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice was a really great game that did mental health very well. It's about a woman named Senua who goes on a quest to overcome this curse that she has and also save her lover's soul. The curse that she has is just psychosis, which manifests in a way of us hearing a bunch of voices that comment on the different things that we do as we play. However, the game's puzzle and its progression and its overall design all work around and with her condition. The devs could have very easily gone the easy route and just made a sanity meter or something else similarly as gimmicky to add to the design. Senua making Senua's voices only get a bit louder if you take more damage or things like that. But they didn't. Her psychosis is an ever-present thing throughout the game. The way you play doesn't really change that. It just is. And by the end of the game, her curse and the voices tend to quiet down, but it's not because she's suddenly fixed or whatever. I think the final line in the game is something similar to, "It's quiet now. Wait, no, it's just different." In a way to symbolize that she has accepted this curse that she has, allowing her to heal a bit more. She's not fixed. It doesn't go away. Nothing changes. She's just able to accept herself a bit more. By contrast, The Cat Lady is a very dark and graphic and gruesome game about a woman named Susan with depression. This game has major trigger warnings for anyone who wants to play. So please be wary if you do want to do that. But as you play the game, you, like I said, plays a woman named Susan who's very depressed and suicidal. And it's just playing as her trying to seek her happiness again. The main gameplay is destroying these 5 parasites, which are just bad and evil people. And by the end, Susan does end up making it through her depression, coming out the other side, writing blogs about her experiences, and eventually reaching out to people again. And like I said, this game is really dark. As someone who suffers from the same things that Susan does, it's very hard to play, but still like almost cathartic in a weird way. It doesn't shy away from showing gore. It doesn't shy away from showing the ugly parts of depression, the quiet parts of depression, the parts that, media tends to not show you because it's boring. It also doesn't use her illness to be scary. It's just a part of who she is. And it also shows all these things without being gross. There's a lot of times when games try to be, for lack of a better word, edgy in showing their mental health, especially when it comes to depression and suicide. But this game doesn't glamorize it, it's just there. Um, Both of these games, like I said, do it very well, but two different sides of the same coin. One being very real and not afraid to show the ugly parts, and the other just centering a mentally ill person and incorporating their illness into the game's design without resorting to like gimmicky mechanics or fixing them by the end. Compare that to games like The Evil Within or Outlast that just use mentally ill people as set dressings, for lack of a better word. Both use asylum/mental hospitals for their aesthetic. Outlast specifically, a lot of the jump scares or ways that the player can be harmed is from the patients at the asylum. You yourself don't play as a patient, you play as a journalist, but sometimes if you walk past the person, they'll jump out and grab you and you'll take some damage, and things like that. Evil Within doesn't have that, but instead it has one main character that you're trying to find who's mentally ill, but they don't really give this character any real characterization outside of their illness, which also isn't stated. It's just the general crazy treatment. That character could easily be swapped out for almost anything else, and nothing about the game would change. So now you're probably thinking, well, I just have insert disorder here. And what if I just want my character to have it? And of course, making a character and having a certain disorder, you might want to put that on your character. I do the same thing when I'm writing. My stories are an extension of me, and my characters can be a reflection of myself. However, having a disorder does not make you an expert in it. And it's hard to remember sometimes that your experiences aren't universal. The way that I process my depression might be very different from the way that another person does. And the most important thing, I think, is you still need to think about how giving your character a disorder will affect the game. So in Until Dawn, which is a like 80s slasher movie that you can play essentially, there are points between each chapter where you're in a psychologist's office. As you play through it, it gets darker and creepier and more run down. And by the end of the game, we realize who we were playing as in this space was a character named Josh. Now, up until this point, we hadn't actually been playing as him. So he's the only character in the list that we don't really know whose motivations are or like how they're thinking. So after this revelation of realizing that Josh was the one behind all the terrorizing of his friends and that he was also the person in the psychologist chair, he starts acting a bit strange. He starts speaking nonsense. He starts acting weird to the point where the other characters, who are his friends, start calling him cuckoo and crazy. So I think at this point, the devs were attempting to show how the loss of his sisters had impacted his mental health, but it comes across as extremely insensitive. It's very possible that Josh developed this disorder, but was having him turn very crazy at the end the way to go about it? Probably not. Now, while I know some disorders do make people just change the way they act almost on a dime, but that doesn't feel like this. This feels like a gotcha moment. The devs were able to get their plot twist in to say, oh, Josh was behind it all along, and now he's crazy because that's why he did it, without hinting that throughout the story. There's no points where we think, oh, is Josh okay? There's no little hints that give you that idea of like, oh, he's maybe needs some help. And it's just all for what feels like a big gotcha or shock moment. So the main takeaway of today, how do we actually avoid writing stigma? So there's the obvious, hiring consultants and sensitivity readers, people who probably know more than you and will be able to help you in places where there might be some pain points. And then, of course, there's always doing some of your own research. But then there's the less obvious, which I think is self-reflection. As weird as it sounds, when you're writing a story and you're making a character, there's some intent and purpose behind it. That can be as shallow or as deep as you want, but regardless, it's still there. So when you make a character, let's say depressed, how does that affect the rest of the narrative? Um, let's take like normal game design as an example. If a character is going to perform an action, we need to figure out how they're going to do that. Do they just press a button? Does an animation play? Do they do a little mini game to successfully perform the action? The same thought process here applies to narrative design and writing. Okay, your character is mentally ill now. How does that affect the world they interact with? The other characters? How do the other characters treat them? And then there's also the sub questions of why is this even being used? Sure, a character could still be mentally ill, but the moment you explicitly state that in your game, your players are going to think, does this have like an actual reasoning in the game? And they might perceive some of the actions that that character does as a bit differently. So personal story time. When I was in high school, I really wanted to make a horror game. Of course, it never got made because I was A, in high school, and B, knew nothing about anything when it came to game development. But the main gist of this game was that you just played as some guy who is obsessed with numbers and scary stuff happened. A majority of the horror that I wanted to create was that we had this main character who was so obsessed with numbers and patterns that he couldn't see or understand the creepy crap that was going on behind him. So like, as an example, right now I'm giving a talk. So I'm very focused on giving this talk and I'm not really noticing any of the things in my periphery or behind me. So that would be a perfect opportunity for a creepy thing to appear or something to move behind me. And that was the game. So now, besides the fact that this was a bad idea with no solid legs, it all centered around this main character having a compulsive disorder of some kind. And the reasoning he had this was because it would be scary. I knew nothing and still know very little about what a real compulsive disorder is like. But at the time, I felt like I did. You know, it was very common to say, oh, I'm so OCD when it comes to, wanting to be a little neat. We had seen on like some sitcoms and TV that, some characters are weirdly compulsive and like really want things to be a certain way. And that's what I had assumed that having a compulsive disorder was like. So if I put that in my stories, it's fine, right? I'm watching other things that do that. However, it's not. People who have mental health issues are a very vulnerable group of people. Non-mentally ill people are scared of the mentally ill, and a good amount believe that they're violent, when in reality, a lot of them are more likely to be victims. When we use mental health in our stories just to be scary, all we're doing is perpetuating this stigmatization and all the stereotypes that come with it. When we're writing a story or creating a narrative, we are in charge of what happens and we get to decide what goes. So next time when you're writing a horror story and you think, hey, wouldn't this be scary? Just think a little harder about why that is scary and how can you change that to still be in your story, but not feed off of negative stereotypes. Anyway, thank you so much for coming to my talk. If there's at any point where I said something wrong or said something that you don't agree with, feel free to send me a message about it. I'm always willing and ready to learn more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ren, for that super dope talk. As for everyone else, did y'all know that some of the games discussed during this conference are available in our Steam sale that is happening right now? So you should definitely go check it out. If you haven't peeked Steam yet, give it a look.